The old warehouse gym on the east side of Los Angeles had witnessed countless displays of strength, but nothing compared to what was about to happen that humid summer evening in 1972. The building smelled of iron, sweat, leather, and machine oil. Rust-colored steel beams stretched high above hundreds of spectators who had packed themselves shoulder to shoulder. Construction workers, wrestlers, dock laborers, amateur fighters, Marines, college athletes, and newspaper reporters all waited for the evening's main attraction. At the center of the concrete floor stood a mountain of a man, Frank Iron Bull Donovan. Standing 6 feet 7 inches tall and weighing nearly 340 pounds, Frank looked less like a human being and more like a walking fortress. His shoulders were impossibly wide. His thick beard framed a jaw carved like granite. Every movement caused the muscles in his arms and chest to ripple beneath his black tank top. People didn't simply admire Frank, they feared him. Rumors surrounded his incredible strength. Some claimed he had once pulled a delivery truck by himself after its engine failed. Others insisted he had lifted an entire motorcycle to rescue a trapped rider. There were even stories that he had snapped heavy chains with his bare hands during carnival exhibitions. Whether every story was true no longer mattered. His reputation had become larger than reality itself. Tonight, Frank intended to make that reputation even greater. A thick steel rod rested across 2 wooden blocks in front of him. It wasn't a trick bar. Several engineers from a nearby factory had inspected it earlier that afternoon. Solid steel, nearly impossible for an ordinary man to bend. Frank slowly rubbed chalk across his enormous palms. The crowd became silent. He wrapped both hands around the steel. His massive forearms tightened. Veins immediately rose beneath his skin like thick ropes. His breathing deepened. The rod refused to move. For nearly 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, metallic groan echoed through the warehouse. The steel began to surrender. Frank roared with effort. His face turned dark red. His entire body trembled. Little by little, the perfectly straight rod curved downward. Gasps erupted throughout the audience. Some people instinctively stepped backward. Others simply stared with open mouths. Finally, the steel bent into a dramatic arc. Frank lifted it high over his head. The warehouse exploded with cheers. People pounded on walls. Whistles echoed through the building. Someone shouted, "I've never seen anything like that." Another yelled, "He's stronger than a machine." Frank soaked in every second of the applause. He loved admiration almost as much as he loved proving people wrong. He slowly lowered the twisted steel and smiled. Then his eyes drifted toward the back entrance. The applause faded. Heads turned. Standing quietly beside the doorway was Bruce Lee. Unlike everyone else inside the warehouse, Bruce wasn't cheering. He wasn't impressed. He simply observed. Wearing a plain, black traditional kung fu uniform, Bruce looked remarkably calm. Compared to Frank, he appeared almost unbelievably small. Several spectators exchanged confused looks. One whispered, "That's him?" Another laughed softly. "He doesn't even look like he belongs here." Frank smiled. This was exactly what he had hoped for. He wanted witnesses. He wanted Bruce Lee himself to see true strength. Frank walked toward him, carrying the bent steel bar over one shoulder. Every heavy step echoed through the gym. When the giant finally stood only a few feet away, the size difference became almost unbelievable. Bruce barely reached Frank's shoulder. Frank looked down with a grin. "So," his deep voice filled the warehouse, "you're Bruce Lee." Bruce nodded politely. "I am." Frank held up the twisted steel. "I heard people calling you the greatest fighter alive." Bruce smiled. "I have heard many things." Frank laughed loudly. "They say speed beats strength." Bruce remained silent. Frank continued. "Tell me something." He held the bent steel directly between them. "Have you ever bent one of these?" Bruce looked at the metal for several seconds before calmly answering, "No." The audience immediately began murmuring. Frank's grin widened. "I knew it." Bruce added quietly, "I've never needed to." The answer confused everyone. Frank chuckled. "Steel doesn't care about speed." Bruce finally looked directly into the giant's eyes. "No." His voice remained gentle. "But people do." Several spectators frowned. They weren't sure what Bruce meant. Frank wasn't interested in philosophy. He wanted dominance. He raised his voice. "How about we settle something tonight?" The crowd instantly became excited. Bruce remained perfectly relaxed. "What would you like to settle?" Frank spread his enormous arms. "Who's stronger?" Bruce answered almost immediately, "You already are." The warehouse fell completely silent. Even Frank blinked. "That wasn't the answer anyone expected," Bruce continued. "I don't think anyone here could match your raw strength." Frank's confidence grew. He looked around proudly. "You hear that?" Cheers erupted again. Bruce allowed the applause to continue before quietly speaking once more. "But strength isn't the only thing that decides a fight." Frank's smile slowly faded. "There it is. I wondered when you'd finally say something." Bruce stepped closer. "May I ask you one question?" Frank crossed his arms. "Go ahead." Bruce pointed toward the bent steel. "Why did you bend it?" Frank frowned. "To prove I'm stronger." Bruce nodded. "To whom?" Frank laughed. "Everyone." Bruce looked around the room. "I think they believed you before you bent it." The audience suddenly grew thoughtful. Frank's expression hardened. "You trying to embarrass me?" Bruce shook his head. "I'm trying to understand." Frank stepped closer until they were nearly chest to chest. "You know what I understand?" Bruce waited. "I understand that people keep talking about your speed." His voice grew louder. "But speed doesn't stop a freight train." Bruce smiled faintly. "No, it steps off the tracks." A few spectators laughed. Frank didn't. His pride had begun turning into irritation. He wasn't used to conversations he couldn't dominate. He suddenly tossed another perfectly straight steel rod onto the floor. It landed with a heavy metallic crash. "There," he pointed at it. "Your turn." Bruce looked at the steel. "I told you." "I don't bend steel," Frank sneered. "Because you can't." Bruce answered honestly. "Probably not." More whispers spread through the crowd. Several men shook their heads. One reporter quietly scribbled in his notebook. Frank raised both arms dramatically. "So the legend admits it." Cheers followed. Bruce remained completely unbothered. Then he slowly stepped toward Frank. "So now," Bruce said softly, "may I offer a challenge?" Frank smiled confidently. "I accept." Bruce extended one hand. "Take my wrist." Confused laughter spread across the warehouse. Frank looked at Bruce's slender arm. "That's the challenge?" Bruce nodded. "Try to bend me instead." Frank burst into laughter. The crowd joined him. Some people actually wiped tears from their eyes. One wrestler shouted, "He's joking!" Another yelled, Frank will snap him in half. Bruce simply stood there, relaxed, balanced, patient. Frank grabbed Bruce's wrist. His hand completely surrounded it. The size difference looked almost absurd. "Ready?" Bruce asked. Frank smiled. "I'll be gentle." He pulled. Nothing happened. Bruce remained exactly where he stood. Frank frowned. He pulled harder. Still nothing. A murmur swept through the audience. Frank adjusted his footing. Now he used both hands. Muscles bulged across his shoulders, his enormous arms flexed, his back tightened. Still, Bruce did not move. Not even an inch. Frank's smile disappeared. Bruce wasn't resisting with force. He simply seemed connected to the ground itself. Frank increased his effort. His breathing became louder. His boots squeaked against the concrete. Sweat formed across his forehead. The audience fell silent once again. Something impossible appeared to be happening. Frank wasn't failing because Bruce was stronger. He was failing because Bruce wasn't giving him anything solid to fight. Every ounce of Frank's power seemed to disappear into empty space. Bruce quietly spoke while Frank continued pulling. "You are very powerful." Frank gritted his teeth. "I know." Bruce nodded. "But you're trying to move me." Frank strained harder. "And?" Bruce smiled. "You've forgotten to move yourself first." Before Frank could understand the words, Bruce made one tiny adjustment. One step. One slight turn of the hips. One gentle redirection. Suddenly, Frank stumbled forward. His own strength betrayed him. The giant barely caught himself before crashing face first into the concrete floor. Gasps echoed through the warehouse. No one understood what they had just witnessed. Frank immediately regained his balance. His face burned with embarrassment. Bruce hadn't shoved him. Bruce hadn't struck him. Bruce had barely moved. Yet, somehow, the strongest man in the building had almost fallen by himself. Frank slowly turned around. The confidence that had filled his eyes only minutes earlier had begun to change. For the first time in years, someone had shown him a kind of strength he had never encountered before. And deep inside, beneath all his pride, Frank realized this wasn't over, not even close. The real challenge had only just begun. The warehouse remained silent. Frank Donovan stood frozen in the center of the floor, staring at Bruce Lee as if he had just witnessed something impossible. Only moments earlier, he had nearly lost his balance, not because Bruce had overpowered him, but because the smaller man had somehow redirected all of his momentum with almost effortless precision. Frank's breathing remained heavy. His enormous chest rose and fell like a steam engine. Around them, hundreds of spectators exchanged confused whispers. "What just happened? Did Bruce even push him?" "I didn't see anything." One reporter replayed the moment repeatedly in his notebook, trying to describe what his own eyes had barely understood. Bruce stood exactly where he had been, hands resting naturally at his sides. No celebration, no smile of victory, no arrogance. His calmness irritated Frank even more than defeat would have. Frank hated mysteries, and Bruce Lee had just become one. Frank slowly cracked his neck before forcing a grin. "Nice trick." Bruce simply nodded. "It wasn't." The giant laughed loudly. "You caught me off balance," Bruce answered calmly. "Yes." Frank smiled again. "Do it again." Bruce looked directly into his eyes. "Why?" "So everyone knows it wasn't luck." Bruce remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded once. "If that's what you need." The crowd immediately backed away, creating an even larger circle around the two men. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Frank rolled his shoulders. This time he wasn't smiling. Every instinct inside him screamed that brute force alone wasn't enough. He had spent his entire life relying on strength. Tonight, strength had failed him, but his pride refused to accept that. He lowered his center of gravity. Bruce noticed immediately. "You've changed." Frank frowned. "What?" "Your stance." Frank looked down. "So?" Bruce smiled slightly. "You're already learning." Those words irritated Frank. "I'm not your student." Bruce nodded. "I know." Frank exploded forward. Unlike before, he didn't simply grab Bruce's wrist. He lunged with both arms, trying to wrap Bruce in a crushing bear hug. The crowd gasped. If those massive arms closed around Bruce's ribs, the fight would end instantly. Frank's hands swept through empty air. Bruce disappeared. Not vanished. Moved. One smooth sidestep, barely more than a whisper. Frank stumbled past him. Before the giant could recover, tap. Bruce's fingertips lightly touched the middle of Frank's shoulder blade. The touch wasn't painful, yet it destroyed Frank's balance. The giant lurched forward another 2 steps before stopping himself. The audience stared in disbelief. Again, no punch, no kick, no violent throw. Bruce simply kept placing Frank where he wanted him. Frank spun around. His frustration was growing. "Stop running!" Bruce tilted his head. "I'm standing right here." The words ignited laughter from the audience. Frank's face turned crimson. He charged again, this time faster. His boots thundered across the concrete. Bruce waited until the last possible moment. Then, a tiny pivot, a slight turn. Frank's shoulders skimmed harmlessly past him. Bruce's open palm briefly touched the giant's elbow. Nothing more. But Frank suddenly found himself spinning. His own momentum carried him in a full circle before he regained control. Several construction workers looked at each other. "How is he doing that?" An older judo instructor standing near the back quietly answered, "He's never stopping the force." "What do you mean?" "He's borrowing it." Frank wasn't listening. Humiliation had begun replacing confidence. He had bent steel. He had lifted impossible weights. Yet he couldn't even touch one man standing in front of him. He clenched his fists. "No more games." Bruce nodded respectfully. "As you wish." Frank rushed in again, only this time he mixed punches with grabs. His fists looked like sledgehammers. Every swing cut through the air with frightening speed for a man his size. One punch smashed into a wooden support post. The timber cracked loudly. Dust rained from the ceiling. The audience jumped backward. Another punch narrowly missed Bruce's head. The force alone created a sharp rush of wind. Bruce slipped underneath it. His feet barely seemed to touch the floor. To the spectators, he appeared almost impossible to follow. He never moved too early, never too late, exactly when necessary. Nothing wasted. Frank threw another hook. Bruce leaned back just enough for the fist to pass inches from his nose. Another. Bruce stepped outside. Another. Bruce rotated. Every attack looked terrifying. Every defense looked effortless. Frank's frustration became visible. His breathing grew heavier. His punches slowed ever so slightly. Bruce noticed immediately. "So much power," Frank growled. "Shut up!" Another punch. Bruce slipped it. "You've trained your muscles." Another attack. Bruce redirected the arm. But you've forgotten your breathing. Frank's eyes widened. How could Bruce know? Years of lifting enormous weights had taught Frank to force every movement. His body had become incredibly powerful, but terribly inefficient. Bruce had recognized it within minutes. Frank roared. He charged once more with everything he had. The warehouse echoed beneath his footsteps. Bruce no longer stepped away. Instead, he stepped in. The audience gasped. The distance vanished instantly. Bruce's body entered the narrow space where Frank's enormous punches could no longer generate full power. Frank instinctively tried to grab him. Bruce's forearm gently redirected the arm. His shoulder brushed Frank's chest. His hips rotated. One short movement, nothing dramatic. Yet suddenly, the impossible happened. Frank's feet left the floor. The 340-pound giant crashed onto his back with a deafening impact. The entire warehouse froze. Dust rose into the air. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. The silence itself was louder than applause. Frank stared upward. He couldn't understand it. Bruce hadn't lifted him. There was no display of impossible strength. The giant had simply fallen. Bruce stepped backward, giving Frank plenty of room to stand. He even offered a hand. Frank ignored it. Slowly, painfully, he climbed back to his feet. His pride hurt far more than his body. The crowd waited for another attack. Instead, Frank surprised everyone. He looked Bruce directly in the eyes. What was that? Bruce answered honestly. You were already falling. I wasn't. Bruce nodded. You just didn't know it. Frank shook his head. I don't understand. Bruce looked around the warehouse before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. When people become obsessed with power, he pointed toward the bent steel bar lying on the floor, they believe every problem must be solved with more force. The audience remained completely silent. Bruce continued. But force has a direction. He lightly tapped Frank's shoulder. If someone changes that direction, he slowly traced a small circle in the air with one finger. The strongest man can defeat himself. One of the younger fighters whispered, So that's why he keeps falling. The elderly judo instructor smiled. Exactly. Frank looked at Bruce with a different expression now. Not anger, confusion, curiosity. For the first time in years, someone had shown him that there was an entire world of combat he had never explored. But curiosity lasted only a moment. His wounded pride returned. No. He shook his head. This isn't over. Bruce nodded. I know. Frank slowly walked toward the twisted steel bar lying on the ground. He picked it up effortlessly. Then he bent it even farther, almost folding it into a horseshoe. The crowd erupted into cheers once again. Frank raised the mangled steel high above his head. I can still do this, Bruce smiled. Yes. Frank pointed the steel toward him. And you can't, Bruce answered quietly. You're right. The giant lowered the steel. For a brief second, victory returned to his face. Then Bruce calmly added, But steel doesn't choose to resist. Frank frowned. Bruce's eyes never left his. A determined human being does. Those words settled over the warehouse like a storm cloud. Every person present suddenly understood. The contest had never been about bending steel. It had become something much greater. One man believed strength was measured by what he could break. The other believed true mastery was measured by what could never be broken. And everyone sensed that the real battle between them was only beginning. Night had settled outside the warehouse. But no one even considered leaving. The crowd had grown larger. Word had spread through the surrounding neighborhoods that something extraordinary was happening inside the old gym. Men who had finished late shifts at the docks, police officers still in uniform, local karate students, amateur boxers, wrestlers, and even several newspaper photographers squeezed through the entrance. Nobody wanted to miss the ending. In the center of the warehouse, Frank Donovan stood alone. His breathing had finally returned to normal. His pride had not. The giant stared at the bent steel bars scattered across the concrete floor. For years they had been proof of his superiority. Tonight, they suddenly looked meaningless. Across the room, Bruce Lee quietly sipped water while speaking with several young martial artists. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't even looking at Frank. That bothered the strong man more than anything. Frank had expected mockery. Instead, Bruce treated him with the same calm respect he showed everyone else. Frank slowly walked toward him. The conversations stopped. Every eye followed the giant. When Frank finally stood only a few feet away, he spoke in a surprisingly calm voice. "You've embarrassed me." Bruce gently shook his head. "No. You embarrassed your expectations." Frank frowned. "What's the difference?" Bruce looked directly into his eyes. "You expected your strength to solve every problem." Frank crossed his massive arms. "It always has." Bruce smiled. "Until tonight." Silence. Frank couldn't deny it. For the first time in his life, someone had defeated his confidence without ever trying to overpower him. The giant took a slow breath. "I still don't believe someone your size could stop me if I really fought." Bruce nodded. "Perhaps." Frank blinked. "You think you might lose?" Bruce answered honestly. "Anything can happen in a fight." That answer confused everyone. Bruce Lee wasn't claiming to be unbeatable. He wasn't pretending to possess magical abilities. He simply accepted reality. Frank studied him carefully. Then a small smile appeared. "So you're human after all." Bruce laughed softly. "I've always been." The tension inside the warehouse eased for a moment. Then Frank pointed toward an empty square of concrete. "No tricks. No demonstrations. No philosophy. Fight me." The room exploded with excitement. Several spectators climbed onto wooden benches for a better view. Photographers rushed forward. One reporter whispered, "This is history." Bruce looked around the warehouse. "I don't want to fight you." Frank's smile disappeared. "You don't have a choice." Bruce calmly replied, "I always have a choice." Frank's patience finally broke. Without warning, he threw a devastating right hook. The punch came so quickly that half the audience gasped before Bruce even moved. Bruce slipped outside the attack. The enormous fist passed inches from his face. Before Frank could recover, Bruce tapped him lightly on the chest. Nothing more. The giant looked confused. "What was that?" Bruce answered. "If that had been a real strike," Frank interrupted. "It wasn't." Bruce nodded. "Correct." Frank attacked again. This time he combined punches with sweeping grabs, trying to trap Bruce against one of the warehouse pillars. The concrete floor shook beneath his weight. Bruce retreated only enough to create tiny openings. Each movement was measured, each step economical. Frank swung low. Bruce stepped over the attack. Frank immediately followed with a left hook. Bruce ducked beneath it. The giant spun, throwing an elbow powerful enough to break ribs. Bruce leaned backward just enough for the strike to miss. The crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing. It wasn't simply speed. Bruce seemed to know where every attack would arrive before Frank himself did. The giant grew more aggressive. He began cutting off angles, driving Bruce toward the corner. "Now I've got you!" Frank roared. Bruce glanced behind him. A brick wall. Nowhere to retreat. Several spectators held their breath. Frank charged with everything he had. His shoulders slammed forward like a charging bull. Bruce waited. 5 feet. 4, 3, 2, 1. Then, everything happened in an instant. Bruce stepped diagonally. His left forearm redirected Frank's shoulder. His right palm briefly pressed against the giant's upper back. Frank's own momentum did the rest. The 340-pound strongman smashed directly into the brick wall. The entire warehouse shook. Dust burst into the air. Loose bricks tumbled onto the floor. A deep crack spread across the old masonry. The audience stood frozen. Frank slowly pushed himself away from the damaged wall. His shoulder ached. His breathing had become ragged. Bruce hadn't struck him. Once again, Frank had collided with his own strength. Anger replaced embarrassment. "You think this is funny?" Bruce shook his head. No. Frank charged without another word. This time there was no strategy, only rage. Punches flew from every direction, hooks, hammer fists, elbows, powerful knees. Each strike carried terrifying force. Wooden crates shattered when Frank missed. A heavy punching bag burst open after one wild swing. Sand poured across the floor. Bruce finally stopped retreating. His expression changed. For the first time that evening, his eyes became intensely focused. The playful calm disappeared. The warehouse became silent. Even Frank noticed the difference. Bruce slowly raised his hands. "Enough." Frank ignored him. He rushed forward again. Bruce moved, not backward, forward. His lead hand intercepted Frank's wrist. His rear hand controlled the elbow. One quick turn. Frank's massive arm was redirected completely. Before the giant could recover, Bruce struck. Not with full power, not with violence, with precision. A sharp palm strike landed against Frank's sternum. The impact echoed through the warehouse. Frank staggered backward. His eyes widened. His breath vanished. It felt as though every bit of air had exploded from his lungs. Before he could recover, Bruce stepped inside again. A short elbow stopped inches from Frank's jaw. A fist halted just below his throat. A knee paused beside his ribs. Every strike had been controlled. Every opening had been found. Bruce could have continued. He didn't. Instead, he stepped back. The audience erupted. They had finally seen Bruce attack. And what terrified them wasn't power. It was accuracy. Frank slowly inhaled. His chest burned. His legs felt strangely weak. No broken bones, no blood. Yet he realized something chilling. Bruce had reached him again and again, without taking unnecessary risks. The giant stared at him. "Why didn't you finish me?" Bruce answered quietly. "Because you aren't my enemy." Frank lowered his fists. "But we were fighting." Bruce nodded. "No, we were learning." Those words struck Frank harder than any punch. The warehouse fell silent once more. One of the oldest boxing coaches in attendance slowly removed his cap. "I've trained fighters for 40 years, he whispered. "I've never seen anyone with that level of control." A young karate student nearby asked, "Could Bruce have knocked him out?" The old coach watched Bruce for several seconds before answering. "He chose not to." Frank heard those words. Deep inside, something finally began to change. For years, he had believed fear created respect. Bruce had shown him something entirely different. True mastery wasn't about humiliating an opponent. It was about having the ability to destroy and choosing mercy instead. Frank slowly unclenched his enormous fists. His breathing steadied. He looked around the warehouse. Every spectator was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. Would he attack again? Would his pride force one final desperate charge? Or would he finally understand the lesson standing quietly before him? Frank took one slow step toward Bruce Lee, then another. The warehouse became so silent that even the buzzing overhead lights could be heard. When the giant finally stopped in front of Bruce, only inches separated them. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Frank raised his enormous hand. The crowd instinctively tensed. Bruce didn't move. Instead of throwing a punch, Frank slowly opened his hand. Bruce looked at it, then smiled. He accepted the handshake. The warehouse erupted into thunderous applause. But neither man noticed, because both of them understood something the crowd did not. The greatest test of the night still remained. Not a contest of strength, not a contest of speed, but a challenge that would reveal whether Frank Donovan had truly conquered the strongest opponent he had ever faced, his own ego. The applause echoed through the warehouse long after Frank Donovan and Bruce Lee released their handshake. For most of the audience, the evening was already over. They believed they had witnessed the end of an unforgettable contest. They were wrong. The most important battle had not taken place on the concrete floor. It had begun inside the strongest man in the building. Frank walked away from the center of the warehouse without saying another word. The cheering slowly faded into uncertain silence. Several reporters hurried after him. "Frank, how do you feel? Do you think Bruce defeated you? Will there be a rematch?" Frank ignored every question. He walked toward the steel bars lying on the ground. One by one, he picked them up. Every twisted piece of metal that had once represented his pride now felt strangely heavy. Bruce watched quietly from across the room. He knew exactly what was happening. Frank wasn't carrying steel anymore. He was carrying years of arrogance. Finally, Frank stopped. Without turning around, he spoke. "When I was 12 years old, the entire warehouse became silent again. My father worked at the docks." His deep voice sounded different now, calmer. "He used to tell me that no one respects a weak man." Frank looked down at his enormous hands. "So I spent my whole life becoming stronger." He smiled sadly. "I believed muscles would solve everything." Bruce slowly walked closer but said nothing. Frank continued, "I learned to bend steel. I learned to pull trucks. I learned to break chains." He paused. "But I never learned how to control myself." Those words struck the audience harder than any punch thrown that evening. Bruce nodded respectfully. "That lesson takes longer." Frank laughed quietly. "I can see that." For several moments, neither man spoke. Then a young boy pushed through the crowd. He couldn't have been older than 13. In his hands was a small notebook. His voice shook with nervousness. "Mr. Donovan." Frank looked down. "Yes?" "Would you sign this?" The giant smiled for the first time that night. He reached for the notebook. Then the boy hesitated. He looked toward Bruce Lee. "Actually," he swallowed, "could both of you sign it?" The warehouse chuckled. Bruce stepped forward. The boy handed Bruce the notebook first. Bruce wrote only one sentence. "Be better than yesterday." He handed it back. Frank looked at the words for a long time. Then he signed beneath them. Instead of writing his name alone, he added another sentence. Strength means nothing without character. He closed the notebook and handed it back. The boy smiled from ear to ear. Thank you. As he walked away, Frank quietly said, I wish someone had told me that when I was his age. Bruce answered, Someone just did. Frank looked confused. Bruce smiled. And he'll remember it. A few minutes later, one of the local wrestling champions stepped into the circle. He was younger than Frank, but nearly as large. He folded his arms confidently. So, he looked at Bruce, if the show's over, he pointed toward Frank, why don't we find out who the real strongest man is? Several men laughed. The wrestler cracked his knuckles. I've beaten men bigger than him. Frank slowly turned. Only hours earlier he would have accepted immediately. His pride would never have allowed someone else to challenge his reputation, but tonight, something had changed. Frank looked at Bruce. Bruce simply waited. The decision belonged to Frank alone. The wrestler smirked. What happened? You scared now? The crowd watched closely. Frank walked toward the younger man. The wrestler raised his fists. Frank stopped only inches away. Everyone expected violence. Instead, Frank reached down, picked up one of the bent steel bars, and placed it into the wrestler's hands. If bending this makes you feel strong, Frank said quietly, then keep it. The wrestler looked confused. I don't want steel. I want to fight. Frank smiled. I don't. The younger man laughed. You afraid? Frank shook his head. No, I'm finally not. The warehouse fell silent. Bruce's smile grew slightly. Without another word, Frank turned his back and began walking toward the exit. The wrestler shouted after him. So that's it. Frank stopped without looking back. Years ago, he said, I would have fought you. I would have needed everyone to know I was stronger. He glanced over his shoulder. Now, I don't. The wrestler had no answer. Frank continued toward the door. Bruce caught up beside him. For several moments they walked together through the quiet warehouse. Finally, Frank spoke. I still don't understand everything you did. Bruce chuckled. You don't have to. Frank looked over. Then what should I understand? Bruce stopped walking. He pointed toward the bent steel bars scattered across the floor. You spent years learning how to bend metal. Frank nodded. Bruce then gently tapped the center of Frank's chest. Spend the rest of your life learning how not to let the world bend this. Frank stood motionless. Those simple words reached deeper than any technique Bruce had demonstrated all evening. Outside, the cool night air greeted them. The city lights stretched across Los Angeles. Traffic hummed in the distance. For the first time in years, Frank felt lighter. Not because he had become stronger, because he no longer felt the need to prove it. Several weeks later, stories about that night spread throughout California. Newspapers described it as a contest between power and precision. Most of them got the story wrong. They focused on Bruce's technique. They wrote about the giant who couldn't catch him. They described the steel bars, the throws, and the dramatic exchanges. Very few understood what had actually happened. The real victory had never belonged to Bruce Lee. It belonged to Frank Donovan. Because the strongest thing he did that night wasn't bending steel. It wasn't lifting impossible weight. It wasn't surviving Bruce Lee's techniques. It was choosing humility over pride. Months passed. Frank returned to the warehouse often, not to challenge Bruce, to learn. He practiced balance before lifting weights. He studied breathing before building muscle. He spent hours repeating simple footwork until his movements became smoother. Whenever frustration appeared, Bruce would quietly remind him, "Power without control creates destruction. Control without ego creates mastery." Years later, people still talked about the night a 340-pound giant tried to intimidate Bruce Lee with bent steel. Most remembered the demonstrations. Some remembered the fight. But the people who had truly been there remembered something else entirely. They remembered the moment when the strongest man in the room discovered that courage wasn't measured by how hard you could strike. It was measured by your willingness to change. And whenever someone asked Bruce Lee about Frank Donovan, he never mentioned the giant's strength. He always smiled and said, "The strongest steel I saw that night wasn't in his hands. It was the heart that finally chose to bend." The old warehouse eventually closed. The bent steel bars disappeared, the crowds went home, the applause faded into history. But the lesson remained. Muscles can bend steel. Technique can overcome strength. But only humility can transform a man. And that was the greatest victory anyone witnessed that night.